Hello, welcome to the Viewpoint. I am Mamadou Mboj. In this country, of course, we will be forgiven for often pairing the notion of diaspora and remittances, since a good number of our households depend on it. And the situation, as I understand it, is largely the same in virtually all of the countries that we call developing countries. So, unsurprisingly, perhaps, as a field of study, the African diaspora has gathered momentum in recent times. According to one review that I've read, this is reflected in the proliferating conferences, courses, PhD programs, faculty positions, book prizes, and the number of scholars who define themselves as specialists. Today, as my guest, is a specialist. He's an adjunct professor of history at Medgar Evers College in New York City, where he teaches U.S. African diaspora history. He's also the co-founder of the University of Amiens and currently teaching a graduate class on the slave trade at the University of the Gambia. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri in Midwest U.S. His name is Dr. Jahi Issa. Welcome to the Viewpoint.
Well, thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be here. Very excited.
Absolutely. As said here, of course, born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri in the U.S., but you've traveled in Africa extensively, and you've got this connection with the Gambia, haven't you? Just tell us about that.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I've made, oh my gosh, I don't even count, way over 50 trips to various parts to Africa. It was always a long dream, a childhood dream of mine. My grandmother, who helped to raise me, along with my mother, would always tell me about Africa when I was a little boy. And she'd always say, never forget what happened. She would always tell me this. And not knowing that I will go off to college and university and major in African history and study what happened, all these things my grandmother would tell me, I would go and later spend my adult life trying to figure out what happened, you know. And so with that, I have my junior sister, my mother's last born daughter, married a Gambian in the United States while I was doing my PhD at Howard University in DC. And my sister came up to visit me and met a Gambian, and they got married and produced a son. And my nephew came here, arrived here about 4 years ago, Lamine Modou, Jay. Hey, Lamine, in the family. And so I came to visit him from Ghana. I was married to a Ghanaian and produced several children. Some of them were born in Ghana. And then came here and really liked it and said, hey, I think it's time for a move. So I moved to the Smiling Coast.
Absolutely. So I was going to ask you what drew you to African diaspora history, but you've already given me sort of the source and an indication from your grandmother. Was it the stories?
Yeah, my grandmother would tell me as a little boy that our ancestors, one of our ancestors who came from who came from West Africa, came with a pot. And this was passed down from her grandmother. And we believe it was her grandmother's mother who was that ancestor that was brought over in the 1850s into the United States. We believe from Ghana, West Africa. And she was very vivid about this, and she claimed that she knew this lady. And but she would always talk about Africa in this pot, and that was really the source of my wanting to study history.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So now let's get into the subject, Africa diaspora history. What is it? For instance, what modules do you teach? I wonder.
Well, the African diaspora in its classical form is there are various three four migration periods, right? You have the early migration of humanity itself starts in East Africa, and they move out about 300,000 years ago. Well, they started 300,000 years ago, and then about 100,000 years ago, some of those Africans move out, and they spread across the world, and some of them changed their colors. All of that is another talk, another section.
Of course, yes.
But that's the first African diaspora, right? And even just recently, about 2 years ago, and it's interesting you bring this up, there is an ethnic group right off the coast of India. And they're they've been there for over 100,000 years. And I think they're called the Jahara people. And they're heavily melanated, very dark, kinky hair, look like if you saw them, you would think that they come from East Africa, but they've been in that region. They are the first group of that wave of Africans who left 100,000 years ago, and they're right in India.
Absolutely, and you know, I often joke around with the idea that when thinking about the term diaspora, actually the whole world is African diaspora.
The entire
if
world.
I take the out of Africa hypothesis,
There's no
then
doubt.
the whole world is
All
African
humanity.
diaspora.
So that's the first. Then you have the second, which is an ancient, I would say the ancient history of so-called civilized human beings. Of course, we're starting with Africa. And then when those ancient civilizations that emerged out of the Nile Valley, ancient Egypt, Nubia,
Nubians.
right. And so that civilization spread all over the world. So that's a diaspora. And then you have the largest of the African diaspora, which came out of two waves. One was the Arab slave trade, which carried more than 50 million Africans out over several hundred years, right? And then that slave trade was toppled by the European slave trade, which carried tens of millions of more Africans out. And then the last African diaspora, but those were the largest dispersal, right? The last African diaspora is a recent one over the last 40, 50 years, where Africans, due to slavery and colonialism, are going to those Western powers that formerly colonized and enslaved them for greener grass, as we say, and that is also a diaspora. But it makes the diaspora, what makes it the diaspora is that it is a triangular relationship between Africa, the people who left, and their relationship back to Africa. So it's a triangle.
So does diaspora mean the same thing as migration?
Well, you have forced migration and you have volunteer migration. So you have two types of migration. Yeah, so the later one is a volunteer migration. But when we talk about the Arab and the European slave trades, those are forced migrations, and those are the largest migrations out of Africa.
That's it. So what constitutes a diaspora, one wonders? Does it matter whether it was voluntary, you voluntarily went there, or it was enforced? Does it matter? What constitutes a diaspora?
It matters because history matters.
All right.
Right, and so, and that's why, and as a scientist, you know, we look at, particularly as a historian, we look at what happened in the past to make sense for the future. We can't even make sense of the future unless we're going backwards and looking.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just trying to get a sense of what a diaspora is as opposed to migration. Does it mean that, do I have to be self-consciously sort of see the connection with the African?
No, you don't have to see the...
What constitutes it, if I can...
Well, one, as I said, these historical episodes, right? And this is the diaspora is a scientific term that we use in the science of study of history and other social sciences. And two, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have, and that you personally have to have an ethnic identity with Africa, but as a scientist, we study those identity. And some of those connections for some people may be unconscious. They may not even know. But then you have particularly like Gambians who've gone to England or to the United States or Sweden, right, and set up communities there because they are recent migrants, right, and they have these relationships back with the Gambia, so there's a consciousness of who they are. But you have some segments of the African diaspora where there is no consciousness at all, but we still go and study those connections.
Absolutely. For me, it's sort of a kind of personal experience sort of make me see, because when we say African, sooner or later the word will come into it. We're going to use black or race and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when we first encountered the word black, let me put it this way. When I first got to Britain, I was 14 years old, went there as a Wolof from Banjul, and suddenly one had to learn about something called black. It was in foreground, as it were, you know what I mean? Because where I'm from, we are majority, we are in power. So this space between the African and the black, how do you see it? Some people use it as coextensive. I'm not sure if that is true in experience. How do you see it?
Well, in history, like we can go back to some of the Indian empires in East India, which brought about a large group of Africans leaving East Africa and Central Africa and being taken away during the Arab slave trade. And they were right consciously, I'm talking 700, 800, 1,000 years ago, about their blackness and how different it was being black in India under captivity compared to their ancestors who were taken away. And so sometimes there is a psychological connection and where you are aware of it, but then sometimes when you look at those Africans who were taken to Iran, many of them have no historical knowledge of what happened other than they're black. And now with social media, they can make connections and look at it, but they are generally not aware. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. It's just that perhaps what I want to explore here is the complexity of this term black.
Yes.
Because it encompasses all sorts of things, all sorts of, isn't it, sub-identities, you know, you have Wolof, Yorubas, Manikas, whoever.
Yes.
All of these things.
Now, when you bring that up, now I can give you an example for what we do with the African diaspora as it relates to the United States. Now, we know scientifically the consciousness of blackness as it regards to the United States occurred around the mid part of the 19th century, when you had all these various ethnic groups who were coming from various parts, Madagascar, Central Africa, from the Senegambia region, from Nigeria, what is now known as Nigeria, and all of a sudden they are converged together on these plantations. And they don't know each other. What does a Wolof know about a Yoruba man? Because before then they had no concept and idea. And over time, over like a 40-year period, they threw away what we call their country marks and adopted this concept of blackness to fight this greater oppression that they were faced with. And there's even a book that even deals with it. It's by it's a professor out of New York University. His name is Michael Gomez. It's called Exchanging Our Country Marks, the Transformation of African Identity to African American. And it's a very powerful scientific study on the subject.
So that's it. So we've seen this evolution, isn't it? This thing called diaspora really came into the fore in the 19th century, really, didn't it? Because a new identity was emerging, or perhaps a new necessity, to name it. There was something emerging.
Yeah, people are trying to make sense.
Exactly.
They're trying to make sense of what happened to themselves historically, yes. And quite interestingly, it is emerging out of the former British, those who were subjugated and enslaved by the British. And that's a whole nother reason why the British allowed this form of scientific inquiry by these Africans who were taken away. And they were really able to study and observe and formulate these concepts and ideals of not only just black diaspora, but Pan-Africanism and things like that. All of these concepts are coming out of those experiences, of those traumatic experiences.
And race science was also emerging.
Yes,
Wasn't
race
it?
science
That
is
sort of
emerging,
thing.
and they're trying to, and in fact, it's interesting you bring that up. Not only is race science emerging, but these Africans who were brought over and enslaved in the West are fighting it, scientifically too. They're writing against them like, this is not true. This is not who we are. Yeah, you have conquered us and enslaved us, but this is not who we are. And so, and it's an ongoing issue too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, scientifically.
Yes. So in the end, what is really the goal of African diaspora history? After I've done a 3 or 4 year course, how would you expect ideally, as it were, from that graduate?
Well, you ever heard of the movie Black Panther, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it was one of the best-selling movies in the world,
Yeah.
right? $1 billion was generated from it. Well, you had people who had to study these concepts. Without that, you wouldn't have a movie like that, right? So the people who were consulted, they were all scientists within this field that we're talking about, the African diaspora.
Absolutely. That's interesting. So now, but when we look at this, I know that you did your PhD thesis on Marcus Garvey movement,
Yes.
as it were. So, but it seems as if that notion of coming back,
Yes.
it has waned, though. How do you see it over the years? I think there was a time, or is it having sort of kind of second wind? Because right now we've known in Ghana with the year of return.
Yeah, it's having a second wind, undoubtedly. This is probably, over the last 10 years, is really the largest Back to Africa movement since the Garvey movement. And of course, as you say, I studied Garvey. I have a book coming out on Garvey. It's on the Garvey movement and his experience in the American South, which represented the largest amount of Garveyite branches around the world. There were more than 1,500 branches. And without Garvey, we wouldn't have a Gambia, we wouldn't have a Ghana, we wouldn't have Senegal. We look at the flags of Senegal and Ghana and many of these other, this is all coming from Garvey. And that push during the turn of the 20th century, right after the world wars. This is what the people wanted collectively, not only in the West, Garvey coming from Jamaica, whose ancestors may have been recently brought over from Africa, but it also impacted Africa in itself. Many of the African leaders, Sheikh Anta Diop, Amilcar Cabral's father and mother were the founder of Guinea-Bissau.
Amilcar Cabral.
Amilcar Cabral, Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta. These were all Garveyites, and their parents were Garveyites. So this is the impact that Garvey had on the world. And I study the Garvey impact in the American South and their relationship and how they looked at Africa. And that's why I say this is it is a triangular study. It's not just studying them in the United States, but how they view Africa over time and space.
Yes, absolutely. It was quite interesting, wasn't it, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s? Some of our intellectuals, especially the Francophone, they looked to America in the, when we were trying to chart, as it were, our independence in terms of ideas, the Sheikh Anta Diop's, the Senghors.
Yes.
So you had the Harlem Renaissance influencing their thinking.
Yes.
You had people like Alan Locke.
Yes.
His ideas, as it were, the new man. So there is really that connection. But I wonder, African diaspora studies, would you teach it the same way that you do in the US and over here?
Yes, I do.
Within the space, sort of
Well,
make a difference. I wonder. I was just
well,
curious about that.
it is. There are some differences, but there aren't. And you know, I had class last week at the University of Gambia with my graduate students, and I was basically telling them, look, you know, I was born in the U.S., but I've traveled extensively throughout Africa in the villages, studying the tradition and the culture. Um, but you know, I have a lot of things to learn about Africa. It's very little. My mother wasn't born. My grandmother, you know, was not born in Africa. And so all these years away means we have a lot to talk about, right?
That's absolutely true.
It's a plenty to talk. 400 years away, you know, and this is what we're dealing with now. We find this happening in Ghana. Not only Ghana, but there's a large group of African diasporans from the Caribbean and the United States getting off the plane to the Gambia every day. And so you find this happen. There is an unspoke of Africa, back to Africa movement as we speak now. And so there's going to be a lot of things that each side, those who remained in Africa and were not taken away, they're going to be curious about those who were taken away and vice versa. So there's a lot to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly the point. But because you teach it, when you come over here, of course, you begin to see the subtleties, the differences within.
Yes.
And you begin to see the complexity. We've still got that ethnic
and I'll
based
give you
identity, which perhaps you've lost.
I'll give you a prime example. My relatives here were really trying to rush me to get married. Like, you're not married, you've been divorced, you need a wife. I'm like, no, I want to hold out. No, we want to find you one. So I went up to one village up in Bessie. Right, and among the Sarahulis, they wanted me to introduce me to a young lady there, and I was like, and I met her, and we talked, and the family wanted to know, was I a slave? So now, you know, here I studied the slave trade,
absolutely,
right, and I'm a historian now. I'm like, what does that have to do? In my mind, I'm like, what does this have to do with whether or not I married her? But to them, that was a big issue. So I really sat down and really thought about it. And I said, well, no, I'm not a slave. But the caste system of slavery that still exists here, things that we fought many years in the U.S. to rid ourselves from, still exist in some parts of Africa. And like I said, this leads to many discussions, right, that we have to talk about and convey on, because it means two different things.
Absolutely. Right? If not the caste system, then the ethnic identity, as it were. You do see some writers, for instance, I think even Wole Soyinka once suggested this in the Open Soul of a Continent, I think the book was. Have we really got that sense of nationhood?
Yes.
It appears as if that primary allegiance, as it were, is to the ethnic group than to this notional national identity, as it were.
It takes time. Look, when the United States became a nation, and when they declared themselves a nation in 1776, after fighting their maternal and paternal grandparents, the British, right? And then about 10 years later, they become a nation officially. It took them a long time to really understand who they were. It didn't happen overnight. You know, you look at America 18, 20, 50 years after it was born, it was a wasteland. There was really no concept, but they were trying to shape and force themselves into this new identity of what an American is. So the same thing about the Gambia, same thing about Ghana, the same thing about Africa in itself. We're still going through this process. And now you have this other issue where these Africans who were taken away are seeking to come back. You know, and this is something that African leaders in themselves on the continent never had to deal with. And so we have to sit down and discuss these issues because they are happening. and they're going to continue to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As I call it a generational game, really. These
Yes.
things, it takes a long time. So you mentioned the slave trade. I mean, well, about the slave being a slave and
Yeah.
stuff. It takes me really to the slave trade, which I sort of wonder, really, what do we need to know? You know what I mean, about the slave trade that explains, as it were, current formations as we see them, as they affect us right now.
I don't know in the Gambia, because everybody is categorically black,
Yes.
right? But ethnically, you may be Wolof or Mandinka or
Sarahuli.
Serahuli or Fula, Ava, but everybody looks like each other for the most
Absolutely.
part, right? And so during World War II, when Hitler invaded England and
he
even
just
had
missed
these
England, France,
and they had
Poland,
their
all
these
of
are
them.
ethnic wars.
Yes,
We see this right
yes,
now
yes,
going on
yeah.
with Russia, and these are ethnic wars. These are European. You know, we talk about the issues that we have in Africa, but if you sit back and you see what's going on now with Russia, Ukraine, the Anglos fighting the Slavs. It's no more different than the Mandinkas having an issue with the Fula, or the Akans having an issue with the Eves in Ghana, or I can go to Nigeria and say the same thing. We're
So
human
it seems
beings.
it's almost like they try to form the nation state out of that ethnic.
Yes.
Whereas here they just disregarded that bit.
Yes.
Completely different formations there. Quite remarkable.
Quite different,
but
but
still
however,
relevant. That's exactly what it is.
It's very relevant. But however, when we look at what happened to the Jewish people, these European ethnic people who adopted Judaism as their religion, when you look at them and what Hitler did to them, right? And you go back and you see this has happened to them several times over the last several hundred years, over the last 1,000 years, where they were not accepted among people that look like them. So these are ethnic differences. So this is why
Even the gypsies.
yeah,
suffered
and I
similar
grew up
fate.
in St. Louis, Missouri, in a predominantly Jewish community, and they had this slogan of "Never again." What Hitler had done to them under they call it the Holocaust, right? But African people have their own Holocaust to talk about too. They have their own great maafa, as a Swahili word. They said great destruction, right? And these things have to be conveyed. So this is why we must deal with the slave trade. It affects us. There's not one African family from West to Central Africa that didn't lose someone, right? That was not personally affected. And if you really look at it, these new sciences that are coming out, they're still being affected by this. So this is why we study the slave trade. It's a major study in the field of social science. Another reason we study it, right now in the United States, there's a big push for reparations, right? So when we talk about reparations, the United States has paid reparations to the indigenous people who, you know, the Europeans who came, they came as settlers, and they annihilated the indigenous populations in the United States. And many of them, several hundred years later, were able to sue the United States for reparations. Even during World War II, when the United States went to war with Hitler and Italy and Japan, there were a lot of Japanese citizens in the United States that had all of their property confiscated, and they were put into prisons camps in during World War II. And they 40, 50 years later, they were able to sue the U.S. government for wrong injustice acts, and they got reparations for it. So now in the United States, those blacks who were impacted by the transatlantic slave trade are now seeking redress by petitioning the government to ask them to pay for those unjust acts.
Yes, wasn't it staggering that when they outlawed slavery, then those who were compensated were the slavers?
Yes,
in
yes.
history, wasn't it,
Yeah,
that happened?
yeah,
Extraordinary.
especially with the British. Yeah,
Especially
yeah, yeah, when they
with
outlawed it. Yeah, so, and these are issues. These are issues that are going to come up. They're not going anywhere. And this is why you study this. You have to study it.
Absolutely.
You have to study it because we live in a global economy now, and capitalism, whether some of us like it or not, it is the dominant economic trend in the world. And global capitalism started with the slave trade. So they're interconnected. You know, you can't separate it. You can't separate it. So when people say history doesn't matter, we need to forget all of this, and no, even when you go to a medical doctor, I went to see an eye doctor the other day to get new glasses. The first thing they ask for is your medical history. You know, do you have diabetes? Do you have high blood pressure? Without that, they can't even make the proper diagnosis, right? So the same thing as we as human beings, we have to know what happened in the past so that we can predict the future. History is essential.
Absolutely, but that's really very, very, very interesting because whilst you were talking there, I was just thinking of the descriptive part of discourse and the prescriptive stuff. Once we've got that understanding, I think that is why sometimes people are so frustrated and say that, oh, history doesn't matter. But it does. Maybe what you want from history is that, okay, with that understanding, what actions would it lead me to? I once heard the Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Anthony appear, saying that that's how he approaches concepts. So in this context now, with this understanding of how slavery is still impacting us right now, and where I want to go, I imagine, because this is also the job of the doctor, to prescribe, I imagine what actions this understanding should lead us to.
Yes, let me give you a prime example. You've heard of Malcolm X.
Yes.
Do you think there are a lot of Gambians who, if you were to put a percentage on Gambians who say that they've heard of Malcolm X or saw a video or maybe even read something, what percentage would you say?
Boom, 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 boom. Well, there was a time, I think I would have said, I don't know, 60, 70, but that would apply more up to the urban.
Yes, right.
So if I were to
take
the urban areas, there was a time, I think I'll be confident enough to say that
you say 50, 60%.
When I was younger, in the urban areas.
What if I was to tell you that
Mm.
Malcolm X was a Bambara from the Gambia? How would that shape how you saw Malcolm X? What does that mean that he is a Gambian? He's from the Senegambia region. That his ancestors were taken not 500 years ago, but 200 years ago from the Senegambia region.
Absolutely. And
we know what ethnic group that he was taken from.
Bambara, that's quite interesting. So, but again, with me being here, I already take that for granted. We know that the Wollops, Bambaras, Fullers, Phyllis Whitley, our poet.
I was going to bring her up, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yes.
So we already have that perspective that the modern African American or black, whatever you call them, they all went over as Wollops and Serers and Yorubas and all of these things, and that was where it came. So one takes that sort of for granted. Then perhaps, you see, what I'm trying to do here is to balance what is it, the commonalities and the differences. And then
my first trip to Africa in 1994 was to Egypt. Why did I choose to go to Egypt? Because that's humanity's oldest living civilization. Not only was I not the only person on the airplane, there were hundreds of others on other airplanes, thousands coming in that same day to do what? To go to Egypt to view the historical monuments. Egypt's GDP is highly affected by historical tourism, right? I've been to Rome. I've been to Italy, right? Historical tourism, right? Even if you go into Washington, D.C., people want to go and see the monuments there, historical tourism, right? Last night I was with one of my good friends. His name is Hakeem, and He's an R&B singer. He grew up in the U.S. His family, his brothers, they had a group called the Boys. They were real big. And he and his family moved here about 20 years ago, and he still lives here. And we were sitting up talking about our experiences as Africans born in the diaspora, coming back and living in Africa. And he's a musician, and I was talking about the indigenous culture of Africa and what I've seen in Ghana and what I've begun to see in the Gambia. And he said, Doctor, he said, do you know what? Right down the street, the origins of the kora, the 21 string instrument, the kora, was invented right here in Bruford. I said, what do you mean? He said, it was invented less than a 3-minute drive down the road from where I live. I said, you mean the kora itself, the internationally well-known, well-accepted, highly complicated African instrument that not only are Africans using, but Europeans are using, it's being studied all over the world, was invented here, right down the road? I said, what, is there a museum out there? Is there a shrine there? Oh, no, nothing. I said, why not? That's historical tourism. That can bring in money. This is why we study history. It's not just the core, it's so many other things. But we have to value ourselves first. We have to understand who we are historically and what happened to us. And so then once we begin to understand, we'll begin to value things like the kora being birthed right here in the Gambia, not too far from this location, a 30-minute drive from this location.
That's it. The history of culture being the history of migration. Some people say that.
And from history, culture, migration to economic opportunity.
To economic opportunity. That's
and this is what it's about.
Absolutely. But this is interesting. I've heard this argument made, because I think what you mean by historical tourism, I think this way what we call heritage tourism.
Yes, heritage tourism, yes.
Similar thing. How do you respond to this argument? That this whole thing about heritage tourism, this kind of commodification of one's culture for somebody else's gaze, so that you'll have some money from it. On the face of it, it's not too bad, but again, what should underpin this culture is a deep connection to it, so that perhaps that might help you to get out of this current economic mess. We know how much we are contributing to our mess.
Yes.
So, or we go all the time talking about African culture, this, the dignity, the depth and all of that. But why is it that it hasn't infused? Is it where the outlook, the actions, what we do? What do you respond to that? That this is all quite cold now. It seems
I think
so
we're still
removed.
waking up. We're still waking up to who we are as African people, as black people. You know, because for so long we were told we were nothing. And there's no value in our tradition and our culture. You know,
there's no value. Just hold it there. We'll take a break. When we come back, we continue from there.
All right,
that lack of value in what we do. Thank you very much there. We'll go for a quick break. We'll be right back.
I am the light goddess. Everything I touch turns into light. I am the light at the end of the tunnel, and my technology is the answer. I am the happiness in your life. I keep you connected, and I am Q Power. I am Q Cell. I am Sunubus. We innovate, others follow. Call 111 for more information.
Hello, welcome back to the Viewpoint. Today I've got Dr. Jahi Isa, and we're talking about African diaspora history that he teaches in university and the slave trade. and how we must understand that so that we can move on forward. Essentially, that's what we want. So just before the break there, you were talking about how we devalued, as it were, some aspects of, at least, I hope, some aspects of our culture. Society.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
One thing, and me, I'm here with a good friend of mine who's also a professor. He's moved here, and he's also a professor, but he's a professor of clinical psychology, right? And so here I'm a historian, he's a psychologist, and we're looking at this historically and psychologically. And in the West, at least in the United States, we were able to garnish up enough intellectuals and technically trained people to help us to deal with these issues, right? Where they're talked openly in society that, we were demoralized. And for so long, we thought very little about ourselves and our contribution to humanity. And so when you look at a place like the Senegambia, and I hope the religious clerics really try to, as the Rastas would say, overstand me, right? And not understand me, but overstand what I'm about to say. We must look at the good and the bad that came with the Islamic Crusades, no more than we have to look at the good and the bad that came with the European slave trade. And we must admit there has been some bad, and we have to look at that. In Swahili, there's this concept called kawaida, and it means tradition with reason, right? There are some traditions that we really need to look at, right, and say, okay, will this help us moving into this highly complex global world that we're moving into, right? How are we going to see ourselves and our children and our children's children 30 or 40 years ago? Why is it a place like Dubai, which was a sand wasteland, why is it that they were able to, 70, 80 years ago, they were just camel nomads, but yet they were able to take that and make it into a paradise, right? Why are they different than those of us who's were born in this segment of the world, right, who've gone through similar, even worse, but our history is more ancient.
That's
right?
But
so,
that's interesting. You've said that. Why are they so different? They've done this. They've done so well in these areas. I've heard some commentators saying that when it comes to perhaps socio-economic advancement, the reasons for that are more contingent than we realize. You do have these agencies that come with their one-size-fits-all,
yes,
but you realize that it doesn't quite work like that. And even this, your psychology collaboration here, if you can call it that, quite interesting there. I once heard Bertrand Russell, the Cambridge philosopher, say that when we analyze politics, we tend to take insufficient account of the psychology
yes,
of people, which is perhaps very important here, given our situation. We've applied all sorts of formulas, but for some reason what we do undermines our, our
that's
desire
where the psychological
to,
issue
psychological.
comes in. And we talk about this in the U.S., we have people who are now trained in psychology, psychological history, where we can go back and they can give you a real good, valid explanation that makes sense as to why we haven't moved forward and other groups have. And so all of these issues are important, and this is, I guess, one of the reasons why you asked me to come in and talk to you briefly.
Absolutely. And this concept that you call the Swahili word, tradition with reason.
With reason, kawaida.
It's an extraordinary term, because I tend to, when I talk to political scientists, I said, I'm trying to look for the right categories of how to discuss my situation, my society meaningfully.
Yes.
As it were. When I look at the sort of the political spectrum of the West, you have a left-right divide. It doesn't quite apply here. So I even tried the idea of the modernizers and the traditionalists.
Yeah.
Perhaps how do you talk about this kind of society that is so traditional? Look at your your Sarahole episode, experience.
Yes.
That's it. And in other areas, you see a similar kind of conventional, traditional thinking.
Well, as a scientist, I look at the world quite differently. And as a historian, I'm looking at the history. I know that dates have a very meaningful impact on human behavior, historical events. I know this. So when I went into Bessie and I met with this Sarah Hooley family, what immediately came to me is this particular date, two dates. One 1471 and the other one 1591. Why those dates? 1471 is the date where the first Europeans set up a major embassy in Africa. First, that's the purpose of trade. Now, these Europeans, the Portuguese specifically, they were coming into Africa at first for 20 or 30 years, just snatching people out. We're talking about the 1430s up into the 1450s. But then they met great oppositions. This time, Africa was equal with Europe. It wasn't always that Africa had the underhand. No. There was a time in our history when in those early encounters with Europeans, there was equal. They saw us as equals. How do I know? I've even sent you images what these early European explorers, whether it was the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, or the English, when they were coming into Africa, they would draw these pictures because they were studying. They were like, okay, we can't defeat them this way. How do we look at them and study their history and their culture to gradually gain full control? Now, 1471, when the Portuguese were coming, they were really chasing this legendary king named Mansa Musa that we all know about here, right? Because this region was a part of the great Songhai Empire.
Mali,
the great Malian Empire, and later the Songhai Empire, right? And we know that Mansa Musa made this region famous by his trek from this region to Egypt and then to Saudi Arabia.
Mecca, yes.
And so this is what set the stage for global capitalism. We've been taught historically, and this is why I sent you this image of this book by this African-American former journalist, and now he teaches at Columbia University. His name is Howard French. The book is called Born into Blackness. It just came out. And he's a former New York Times writer. He's written another book called Africa, China's Second Continent. You know, explaining these very complex relationships with Africa and China. But in his latest book, Born into Blackness, he starts off with the date 1471 because this is the first encounter. And when Europeans first encroached into Africa, they didn't see an inferior people.
Yeah,
they saw
in Gambia, I think it was 1455.
1455, yes.
When they first came round.
Yes.
yeah.
They saw
was Cape
highly,
Verde as well.
They saw highly complex societies organized. They saw empires, right? And so he explains that it was the setting up of a fort in what is now known as Ghana by the Portuguese, and even Christopher Columbus helped in building this fort, right? And it was for trade initially. They were looking for this yellow stuff that we call gold. That was the base of the global economy. It still is today, right? And then there's this other historian who is considered the world's top historian. His name is Gerald Horne. He's also African American. He teaches in the university in the U.S. He has a book he gives the date of 1591. So 1471 and now 1591, 100 and something years later, he's saying that was the end. That was the beginning of the Great Maafa. Not that slavery started, but something happened in 1591 that had a ripple effect all over Africa, and which Africa is yet to redeem itself from because we don't understand it. And that is the defeat by the Arabs led under the Moroccans, and they were conjoined by the British to come into what is now the Songhai Empire, and they defeated that last dynasty of the Askias. And once that happened, that opened up all of Africa for European exploitation, all right? But before then, when Europeans were coming in, they came in as equals. We know, we have the paintings. There are some paintings of the Portuguese going into the Congo, and they're bowing down to the king, right? And so, because they saw how powerful and how organized these groups were. So I think as we move on with our discussion, and even as we move on as black people, we must take history a lot more serious. Everybody else does, right? And you can't move into this modern world without studying the past. And we must understand it. And every group of people, whether it's the Chinese, we tend to forget that when Europeans went into China, they put the entire Chinese people on opium. Right? They had to, you call it the opium wars.
They had to go to war, yeah.
Right? Right? And look at China now. Right? Look at China now.
Yes.
Right? So we must understand these historical episodes so that we ourselves can move forward. And it is very important, and this is why I was bringing up this issue of historical tourism. You know, particularly, you know, Ghana did something that no other African country had ever done. It's new, but it's going to happen over and over and over again if you understand the right formula and how to do it.
That was the year of return.
The year of return. And how they did it. It was very strategic. It just didn't start with the current president, Akufo-Addo. It started with the previous two presidents, Rawlings and then Mahama, and then Akufo-Addo was able to take over and really, he did what because I'm now understanding that Mansa Musa was not the first to go to Mecca, right? But he did it in a way,
absolutely,
right, that we
absolutely,
remember,
yes.
right? And what President Akufo-Addo,
apparently he brought down the price of gold.
Yeah, he brought it down. And so that $2 billion that they were able to generate in the year 2019 was historical, just from tourism, heritage tourism, just focusing on those millions of Africans in the Caribbean and in the United States. No one ever thought that would lead to, you know, new airplanes being built. You know, it changed the area of the aviation business. You know, new airplanes, because you had this form of tourism that wasn't there before, right? And I really believe that Ghana just cracked the surface, right? They just cracked the surface. Now, there are some other things that I believe that is happening in this, with these people returning, that, you know, probably we'll have to talk about off camera.
Well, that was going to be my last question. We're coming towards the end now. Going forward, the African diaspora, that relationship between the diaspora that's out there and the mother continent. Already we talk about remittances, as I've said in my introduction, that in this country, whenever we mention diaspora, next is remittances, because it's so huge. It contributes more than 20% to our GDP and that sort of thing. But obviously, there are richer ways, other ways as well.
Yes. But just imagine if that brain, those skilled resources were here. Well, how much would it contribute had they not left? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Of course.
You know, people always talk about Africa in the sense of all of the resources that are here, the gold, the oil, the diamonds, the bauxite, all of this stuff. But the most important resource is the human capacity. We look at places like Japan again, which has no natural resources, but they put all their money in the human resource. That is your greatest resource. Right? I brought some rice back from Ghana a few weeks ago. It's a red rice. And I shared about 10 pounds with friends, And I was telling them, they were like, where did you get this rice from? I said, it was originally grown here. Red rice. It's the original genetic makeup of the grain. That particular grain originated here, and it's so nutritional than this Asian-based rice that we don't know what it is, right? And they were like, how did that happen? I said, well, we know this because we study history. We know the type of foods that were grown here before colonialism. But what is interesting, there was a young lady from the United States who happens to be black, who studied food agriculture in Africa in this relationship to the United States, went to Ghana, right? Got her graduate degree, went to Ghana, organized women to start producing this ancient rice that is originally from here, and now they have a surplus. They're exporting the rice all over the world just by using history.
And that's quite interesting that you said that. Recently, I attended a lecture given by the London School of Economics lecturer, Dr. Noptul Paisley, talking about this idea of diasporacracy. She called it quite interesting term there. And in Liberia, during the tenure of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, you have lots of African Americans going to Liberia with their technical expertise.
Yes.
This is really the key, the technical expertise, and in key areas. And they did some wonderful stuff, really. They changed things, as it were, and they were in the middle of the process of transition, as it were, and they changed this. They impacted positively to all of this. Is it something like that?
Yes, these are the same people
yes.
who were taken away. Yeah. Remember, those who were taken away had high technical experience. It was a transfer of technology, not just the human labor, but the technology that went with it. The rice growers ended up in South Carolina, right? Those iron workers, those who understood the ancient science of iron smelting, they ended up in Brazil. They ended up in Jamaica, right? And so what we're talking about is the return of that technology that left several hundred years ago. And this is what we're doing. I'm here. The skill that I have, who knows what I was doing up in Timbuktu 300 years ago, right? Maybe I was lecturing at the University of Sankora, right? And now I'm back.
Absolutely. I've even heard some people say that actually the decisive shift in our economic fortunes and socio-economic change, that decisive shift may possibly come from the diaspora.
Yes.
Who would make that turning,
yes.
as it were. Thank you very much.
The potential is there. It's unlimited potential.
Absolutely. We've come to the end of the program. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Jahi Isa.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well,
yes, I hope your audience enjoyed our conversation.
Absolutely. I'm sure that they did. Until the next time, I'm Umudumbuch. Goodbye.